Whitehall Palace was once the most brilliant symbol of absolute British royal power. However, in early 1649, a rough wooden scaffold was erected right outside this magnificent banqueting house. The purpose of this legal battlefield was to execute King Charles I. The new rulers wanted to trample on the throne's pride, right where royal power once reigned. The deposed king stepped out to the execution ground under the strict supervision of armed military forces. No leniency whatsoever was offered by the victors. The executioner swung the axe, severing the life of King Charles I with just one precise strike. A terrified groan from tens of thousands of citizens echoed, marking the moment the crown was drowned in a sea of blood. In the early 17th century, the English crown faced a severe and inherited financial crisis. High inflation steadily eroded the government's purchasing power, while the national taxation system remained completely outdated. This rigid tax structure failed to adapt to a changing economy, leaving the monarchy without sufficient revenue. Consequently, the government operated at a constant growing deficit. Meanwhile, the distribution of wealth in England underwent a massive demographic shift. Economic power moved rapidly away from the church and consolidated within the rising merchant classes. As a result, the men sitting in the House of Commons amassed immense financial leverage. They eventually controlled significantly more liquid capital than the reigning monarch himself. This wealth disparity created an unsolvable structural problem for the English monarchy. The king claimed the absolute authority to rule, yet he lacked the independent funding required to actually govern. The crown could not legally impose direct taxes without parliamentary approval, leading to a bitter stalemate. Wealthy lawmakers simply refused to fund the king without securing permanent political concessions. Charles Stuart was born on November 19, 1600, in Scotland. He was the second son of King James VI and Anne of Denmark. In the political plans of the time, Charles was mostly an afterthought. All royal expectations rested on his older brother, Prince Henry. Henry was athletic, exceptionally charismatic, and deeply admired. In 1603, Queen Elizabeth I died, and the royal family moved to London. Young Charles was considered too physically frail to survive the journey. He was left behind in Scotland under the care of guardians. Charles suffered from a severe case of rickets. This bone-softening disease left his joints very weak and his legs visibly bowed. Forced to wear heavy iron braces just to support his body weight, Charles could not walk unassisted until he was almost 4. Alongside these physical struggles, he dealt with a severe speech impediment. He started talking very late, and a heavy stutter hindered his communication for the rest of his life. In that era, a king was expected to project physical strength and speak powerfully. These physical issues were seen as massive liabilities for a future monarch. Despite his weak exterior, Charles possessed a stubborn and formidable willpower. When he finally moved to England, he started a strict routine. He worked relentlessly to overcome his physical limits. He trained hard and eventually became an expert horseman. He also developed into a skilled marksman. Constantly fighting his physical weaknesses gave Charles a very rigid mindset. He relied heavily on strict order and stoic behavior. His mindset remained firmly entrenched in royal prerogative, rendering him fundamentally incapable of adapting his political strategies to changing realities. In November 1612, the royal family changed forever. The beloved heir, Prince Henry, suddenly caught typhoid fever and died. He was only 18 years old. Overnight, the quiet, stuttering 12-year-old Charles became the main focus. He was suddenly thrust into the spotlight as the immediate heir. Charles received a strict and rigorously academic education. Intellectually, he proved to be very capable. He was a brilliant linguist who mastered classical Greek and Latin. He also spoke and read fluent French, Spanish, and Italian. He developed a deep understanding of theology and classical history. However, academic success does not always translate to political competence. His entry into European diplomacy was a complete disaster. By the early 1620s, Europe was torn apart by the 30 Years' War. This conflict was driven by deep hatred between Protestant and Catholic countries. King James I wanted to keep England out of the fighting. James tried to form an alliance with the wealthy Catholic Habsburg Empire of Spain. He proposed that Prince Charles marry the Spanish Infanta. The goal was to secure a massive financial dowry. This money would easily pay off the English crown's debts. Charles and the Duke of Buckingham grew tired of slow diplomacy. Driven by naive romantic ideas, they planned a reckless secret mission. In 1623, the two men used fake names and false beards. They rode across France and straight into Madrid without official permission. This secret trip ended in total political humiliation. The strict Spanish court demanded massive concessions. Spain insisted that England cancel all its anti-Catholic laws. They demanded full religious freedom for English Catholics. Furthermore, they demanded that Charles himself convert to Catholicism. They kept the Infanta guarded and rarely let Charles speak to her. Charles and Buckingham eventually realized the mission was a failure. They left Madrid with no treaty and no bride. They returned to London with deeply wounded pride. The anti-Catholic English public celebrated wildly, unaware of the diplomatic failures. Charles was deeply embarrassed by the entire ordeal. He aggressively pushed King James to declare war on Spain out of revenge. In March 1625, King James died and Charles took the throne. His first major goal was to clean up the royal court. The previous court was chaotic, informal, and heavily defined by excess. Charles possessed strict personal morals and hated drunkenness. He immediately dismantled the previous chaos, establishing a royal household governed by unyielding discipline and stringent moral codes. Charles was a man of excellent aesthetic taste. He is widely considered the greatest royal art collector in British history. He hired famous painters like Peter Paul Rubens to paint majestic portraits. He expanded his collection massively by buying priceless works by Titian and Raphael. He used art to project the untouchable majesty of the sovereign. While his taste in art was flawless, his political choices were terrible. Following the Spanish disaster, he formed a military alliance with France. He cemented this in 1625 by marrying the French princess Henrietta Maria. She was a strict Roman Catholic. This caused instant panic across Protestant England. Charles secretly promised France he would stop punishing English Catholics. He allowed his new wife to keep Catholic priests inside the royal palaces. The optical disaster was severe and immediate. The new queen flatly refused to join her husband's Protestant coronation ceremony. To the English Parliament, this felt like a dangerous Catholic conspiracy. Conflict between the new king and the House of Commons exploded. Traditionally, Parliament gave a new king the right to collect customs taxes for life. These taxes were known as tonnage and poundage. But Parliament deeply distrusted Charles and his religious plans. They broke with centuries of tradition. Parliament only granted him tax rights for a single year. They wanted to force him to call Parliament annually for funding. Charles viewed this as an intolerable insult to his royal power. Believing he answered only to God, he completely ignored the new restriction. He ordered his officials to keep collecting taxes indefinitely. Meanwhile, his chief minister, the Duke of Buckingham, proved incompetent. Buckingham led catastrophic naval operations against Spain. The troops were poorly supplied and lacked clear objectives. The fleet retreated in total humiliation without achieving a single goal. The military failures compounded the following year against France. In 1627, Buckingham led forces to the Isle of Ré off the French coast. The campaign resulted in an absolute bloodbath. Poor planning and disease decimated the English forces. Over 4,000 English soldiers were slaughtered during the retreat. The House of Commons was furious over the wasted lives. Lawmakers immediately drafted articles of impeachment against Buckingham. They demanded his arrest for high treason and criminal incompetence. Charles possessed an unwavering loyalty to his friend. He refused to let the constitutional process proceed. He blindly protected Buckingham instead of securing necessary government funding. Charles used his executive power to dissolve Parliament twice. This prevented the impeachment trial from happening. However, this left the king with no legal way to raise money. The crown desperately needed funds for the ongoing wars. Charles and his council resorted to an illegal financial maneuver. This aggressive policy was known as the forced loan. The crown demanded specific sums of money directly from wealthy landowners. The state made it explicitly clear that refusing to pay was an act of hostility. The enforcement of this decree was brutal and bypassed common law courts. Common citizens were targeted first. Those who refused to pay were subjected to martial law. Many were forcibly conscripted into the military. Others were forced to house hostile, unpaid soldiers in their private homes. The defining constitutional crisis occurred when the state targeted the elite. 70 high-ranking gentlemen refused to pay the illegal tax. Royal agents arrested them and threw them directly into prison. They were denied the fundamental right of habeas corpus. The crown refused to formally charge them with a specific crime. This prevented them from defending themselves in a court of law. 5 of these imprisoned knights sought help from the courts. They demanded that the state either charge them or release them. This became known as the 5 Knights case in 1627. It was a landmark battle between executive power and individual liberty. The Attorney General argued that the king possessed supreme command. He claimed the king could imprison individuals for national security reasons. The judges were heavily intimidated by the crown. They reluctantly ruled in favor of the king. They officially denied bail to the imprisoned knights. This unprecedented ruling struck profound terror into the English elite. It severely shook their faith in the fundamental rule of law. The property-owning classes realized a terrifying truth. The king could legally levy non-parliamentary taxes. He could arbitrarily imprison anyone who refused to pay without trial. The ancient concepts of private property and personal liberty had ceased to exist. The ideological battle lines were firmly established. King Charles I successfully secured his emergency funding. He managed to protect his favorite minister from impeachment. However, he achieved this by aggressively alienating the wealthy demographic. He absolutely required these men to effectively govern the nation. The collision between his absolute power and Parliament was now permanent. By 1628, the English state was paralyzed by a structural standoff between the executive branch and the legislature. King Charles I had effectively bypassed Parliament to fund his military operations through the extra-legal forced loans, but the resulting domestic friction and the disastrous military failures in France left the crown financially exhausted. Recognizing that arbitrary taxation could not sustain a prolonged European conflict, Charles was forced to summon a new parliament to secure official subsidies. The Parliament of 1628 convened in an atmosphere of intense paranoia and legal defensiveness. The property-owning classes, deeply terrified by the implications of the 5 Knights case, refused to open the treasury without securing an ironclad, constitutional guarantee of their liberties. The House of Commons, guided by brilliant legal minds such as Sir Edward Coke, drafted a foundational constitutional document, the Petition of Right. The document was not a radical demand for new liberties, but a meticulously detailed, legally binding restatement of the ancient limits of monarchical power dating back to Magna Carta. The petition explicitly forbade the king from levying any taxes, loans, or financial benevolences without the formal, voted consent of Parliament. It strictly outlawed the arbitrary imprisonment of citizens without due process or a stated legal cause. Furthermore, it prohibited the forced billeting of military personnel in civilian homes and the application of martial law against civilians during peacetime. King Charles I analyzed the petition with profound distaste. He viewed any statutory limitation on his authority as a direct infringement upon his divine right. However, the crown's financial situation was catastrophic. The military required immediate funding to mount a relief expedition to La Rochelle. Operating under severe fiscal duress, Charles made a tactical concession. In June 1628, he formally signed the Petition of Right into Law. In exchange, Parliament voted to grant the king massive financial subsidies. The crisis appeared to be resolved through constitutional compromise. Yet, Charles possessed no intention of honoring the agreement. Charles believed that promises made under financial pressure were not binding. He took the massive subsidies. Then, he almost immediately broke the agreement. He continued collecting unauthorized taxes, fiercely protecting his royal prerogative. The fragile political truce was permanently shattered just 2 months later by a sudden, violent intervention. In August 1628, George Villiers, the Duke of Buckingham, traveled to Portsmouth to organize the naval fleet for another expedition to France. Buckingham's military incompetence and his monopoly on royal patronage had made him the most universally despised man in the kingdom. On August 23, John Felton, a disgruntled, unpaid army lieutenant who had served in the disastrous Isle of Ré campaign, approached Buckingham in a crowded inn. Felton produced a dagger and drove it directly into the Duke's chest, killing the king's chief minister instantly. The resulting reaction exposed a fundamental, irreconcilable chasm dividing the reigning sovereign from the populace he governed. When the news of the assassination reached London, the English public erupted into spontaneous, massive celebrations. Citizens danced in the streets, lit bonfires, and openly drank to the health of the assassin, viewing Felton not as a murderer, but as a national savior who had surgically removed a cancerous tumor from the state apparatus. King Charles I received the intelligence of the assassination while attending public prayers. He maintained rigid physical discipline until the service concluded, but upon retreating to his private bedchamber, the sovereign's psychological armor completely collapsed. Charles threw himself onto his bed and wept uncontrollably for 2 consecutive days. The public rejoicing over the murder of his closest friend deeply traumatized the king. It hardened his political perspective, permanently extinguishing any lingering desire to seek popularity or compromise with the English populace. He viewed the celebrations as evidence of a fundamentally disloyal, radicalized society that required strict, unyielding authoritarian control. The eradication of Buckingham fundamentally altered the internal operational dynamics of the royal court. For the first 3 years of his reign, Charles had relied exclusively on Buckingham for political counsel and emotional support, largely neglecting his young French wife, Queen Henrietta Maria. With his primary confidant dead, Charles pivoted his affections entirely toward the Queen. The previously strained royal marriage rapidly transformed into an intensely devoted, harmonious partnership. While this domestic stability provided Charles with profound psychological comfort, it generated a massive geopolitical liability for the state. Henrietta Maria was a staunch, proactive Catholic who maintained direct diplomatic communication with the Pope and the French crown. As her influence over Charles expanded, the English public observed the royal court isolating itself, within an exclusive aestheticized bubble that appeared increasingly sympathetic to Roman Catholicism. The Queen established an elaborate Catholic chapel at Somerset House, which became a visible hub for wealthy English Catholics and foreign priests. The king, entirely insulated within his harmonious family unit, remained dangerously oblivious to the toxic, creeping paranoia radiating through the Protestant merchant classes and the Puritan factions of Parliament. When Parliament reconvened in January 1629, the legislative body was completely radicalized. The members were furious over the king's blatant violations of the Petition of Right, specifically his continued unauthorized collection of tonnage and poundage. Furthermore, a second, equally dangerous front had opened: theology. King Charles had actively promoted a faction of the Church of England known as the Arminians. Arminianism emphasized strict clerical hierarchy, the beauty of sacraments, elaborate rituals, and the absolute authority of the king over the church. To the Puritan members of Parliament, who advocated for a stripped-down, highly decentralized, and strictly Calvinist theology, Arminianism was virtually indistinguishable from the dreaded Roman Catholicism. They viewed the king's religious policies as a deliberate, systematic attempt to subvert the English Reformation. Recognizing that the House of Commons intended to launch a massive legislative assault against his religious and financial policies, Charles decided to shut down the government. On March 2, 1629, the king issued an executive order to adjourn Parliament. What followed was a physical, unprecedented act of legislative mutiny. As the Speaker of the House, Sir John Finch, stood up to formally announce the king's order of adjournment, two radical members of Parliament, Denzil Hulls and Benjamin Valentine, rushed forward. They physically grabbed the Speaker and forcibly pinned him down into his chair, preventing him from legally closing the session. While the Speaker wept and struggled, and the king's royal guards began to batter down the locked doors of the chamber, Sir John Eliot stood and rapidly read out 3 revolutionary resolutions. The resolutions declared that anyone who introduced popery or Arminianism into England, anyone who advised the king to collect unauthorized taxes, and anyone who voluntarily paid such taxes was a capital enemy to the kingdom and the Commonwealth. The Commons roared their approval just as the doors gave way. Furious at this brazen physical assault on his sovereign authority, Charles I officially dissolved Parliament. He immediately ordered the arrest of 9 leading opposition members, including Sir John Eliot. Refusing to submit to the king's authority or pay the required fines, Eliot was permanently incarcerated in the Tower of London, where he contracted tuberculosis and died 3 years later, becoming an immediate martyr for the parliamentary cause. Following the dissolution of 1629, King Charles I made a definitive administrative decision: he would never summon Parliament again. He resolved to govern the realms of England, Scotland, and Ireland entirely alone, utilizing only his executive Privy Council. This initiated an unprecedented era in English history known as the Personal Rule, or the 11 Years' Tyranny. Governing without a legislature meant the crown had entirely severed its access to standard taxation. To prevent the immediate bankruptcy of the state, Charles ordered a total geopolitical withdrawal. He signed the Treaty of Susa with France in 1629 and the Treaty of Madrid with Spain in 1630, ending the disastrous, expensive foreign wars initiated by Buckingham. By achieving peace, Charles drastically reduced the operational overhead of the government, allowing the state to function on the standard revenues generated by the royal estates and customs duties. However, peacetime revenues were insufficient to completely erase the staggering £2 million sovereign debt inherited from the 1620s. Charles required new substantial streams of capital. Prevented by the Petition of Right from creating new taxes, the king deployed his attorney general and a team of specialized royal lawyers to execute a forensic audit of the English legal archives. Their objective was to uncover archaic, centuries-old medieval statutes that had never been officially repealed and weaponize them to extract revenue from the population. This aggressive, deeply cynical financial strategy was dubbed fiscal feudalism. The most lucrative maneuver was the revival of the distraint of knighthood. The royal lawyers unearthed a statute from the year 1278, originally designed to ensure the medieval king had a sufficient pool of armored cavalry. The law mandated that any man earning a modest income of £40 a year from his land was legally required to present himself at the king's coronation to be officially knighted. Because the law was entirely obsolete, thousands of wealthy landowners had ignored it during Charles's coronation in 1626. The Crown activated the statute and systematically prosecuted every eligible landowner in the kingdom who had failed to attend. The objective was not to create new knights. It was to levy massive compounding fines for non-compliance. The bureaucratic dragnet operated with ruthless, mechanical precision. Royal agents successfully penalized nearly 9,000 men, extracting a massive £170,000 directly into the royal treasury. While technically legal under the strict letter of common law, the maneuver was universally viewed by the gentry as predatory extortion. The Crown subsequently deployed an even more aggressive legal tactic, the exploitation of the ancient forest laws. During the medieval era, vast tracts of England were classified as royal forests, areas where the monarch possessed exclusive hunting rights and strict building codes applied. Over centuries, the Crown had quietly sold off these lands, or allowed the boundaries to shrink, and generations of aristocratic families had built massive, developed estates upon them. Charles's lawyers bypassed recent history and produced maps dating back to the 13th century, specifically from the reign of King Edward I. The Crown declared that the ancient boundaries were the only legally valid demarcations. Consequently, hundreds of prominent landowners were suddenly classified as illegal squatters who had encroached upon the king's personal property. The state utilized the prerogative courts to levy astronomical fines against the wealthiest men in the nation to pardon their encroachment. The Earl of Salisbury, one of the highest-ranking peers in the realm, was fined an unprecedented £20,000. This tactic successfully generated capital, but it inflicted catastrophic political damage. By systematically attacking the ancestral land rights of the elite, Charles permanently alienated the exact aristocratic class he required to enforce his authority in the provinces. Because the king could not legally tax the English merchants, he extracted their wealth by exploiting another legal loophole, the sale of royal monopolies. While a 1624 statute had banned the granting of monopolies to private individuals, the Crown circumvented the law by selling exclusive production and distribution rights to incorporated companies. The state sold monopolies on essential, everyday commodities, including coal, salt, starch, and iron. The companies holding the monopolies immediately drastically inflated the prices of these goods, driving up the baseline cost of living for the entire population and crippling the free market. The most infamous example was the soap monopoly. The Crown sold the exclusive right to manufacture soap to a corporation composed heavily of Catholic businessmen. Independent soap boilers were forcibly shut down by royal agents, and this newly manufactured, exorbitantly priced, and inferior product was branded by the furious Protestant public as popish soap. The monopolies successfully transferred the wealth of the merchant classes to the state, but they generated an intense, widespread hatred of the king's economic policies across the urban centers of England. The ultimate ambitious financial mechanism deployed during the personal rule was the expansion of ship money. Historically, ship money was a specialized emergency wartime levy. During periods of acute naval threat, the monarch possessed the recognized prerogative to demand that the coastal counties and port cities provide fully equipped warships for the defense of the realm, or pay a financial equivalent directly to the Admiralty. In 1634, King Charles I revived ship money to fund the modernization of the Royal Navy. Initially, he levied it only on the coastal towns, which generated minimal political resistance. However, in 1635, Charles authorized a massive, unprecedented expansion of the policy. Arguing that the defense of the seas benefited the entire nation, the king levied the ship money tax upon the inland counties as well. Furthermore, he demanded the payment not as a one-time emergency measure, but as an annual recurring tax during a period of absolute peacetime. The implications of this maneuver terrified the parliamentary class. If the king could legally levy a permanent national tax under the vague pretext of national defense without parliamentary consent, he would secure an independent, unassailable revenue stream. He would possess the financial capability to maintain a standing royal army and navy, rendering the English Parliament permanently obsolete. The legal resistance to ship money culminated in 1637. John Hampden, a wealthy, principled Puritan landowner and a former member of Parliament, deliberately refused to pay his assessed ship money tax of precisely £1. Hampden did not refuse out of poverty. He refused to force a high-profile constitutional showdown in the highest courts of the land. The case of R.V. Hampden was argued before all 12 judges of the Court of Exchequer Chamber. Hampden's brilliant defense team, led by Oliver St. John, argued strictly on the parameters of the Petition of Right. Because England was not actively at war, there was no emergency justifying the bypass of parliamentary consent. The Crown's Attorney General argued that the king alone possessed the absolute right to determine what constituted a national emergency, and that his prerogative superseded common law. The resulting verdict was a catastrophic Pyrrhic victory for King Charles I. The court ruled in favor of the crown, but only by a razor-thin margin of 7 judges to 5. In the pressurized environment of the personal rule, a divided verdict from the king's own appointed judges signaled a massive structural weakness. The moral victory belonged entirely to John Hampden. The trial publicized the sheer illegality of the king's financial machine. Following the verdict, compliance with the ship money tax completely collapsed across the country. Local sheriffs refused to collect the money, and citizens actively resisted the royal bailiffs. By the late 1630s, King Charles I had successfully funded his government for a decade without a legislature, constructing an intricate, extractive authoritarian apparatus. However, the system operated entirely without the consent of the governed. The king had exhausted his legal loopholes and systematically alienated every demographic of the English power structure, the aristocracy through the forest laws, the merchants through monopolies, and the general public through ship money. The fiscal engine of the personal rule had reached its absolute mechanical limit, leaving the regime vulnerable to the sudden, violent ideological crisis that was brewing in the north. While the financial mechanisms of the personal rule systematically alienated the English elite, King Charles I simultaneously manufactured a severe ideological crisis. The fiscal engine of the state was fragile, but the religious friction he introduced proved to be the explosive catalyst that permanently shattered his government. In 1633, Charles appointed William Laud as the Archbishop of Canterbury, granting him supreme authority over the Church of England. Together, they enforced a rigid, ritualistic doctrine known as Laudianism. To the Puritan majority, the Reformation was defined by the removal of visual idolatry and a strict focus on Scripture. Laud and Charles aggressively reversed this aesthetic. They ordered the communion tables, traditionally placed in the center of the church, to be moved to the eastern wall and heavily railed off as sacred altars. Clergy were mandated to wear ornate vestments, and stained glass was restored. For the English public, this was not a matter of interior design. It was an existential threat. They interpreted these visual changes as a terrifying state-sponsored slide back into Roman Catholicism. Resistance to Laudian reforms was met with severe state violence. Laud bypassed the common law and weaponized the Court of Star Chamber to crush dissent. In 1637, three prominent Puritan writers, William Prynne, Henry Burton, and John Bastwick, were prosecuted for publishing anti-Laudian pamphlets. They were heavily fined, sentenced to life imprisonment, and subjected to public mutilation. In the pillory, executioners hacked off their ears and branded their cheeks. Rather than silencing the opposition, the sheer brutality of the punishment transformed the men into national martyrs, solidifying the public consensus that the king's administration had become a tyrannical force. The fatal miscalculation that destroyed the personal rule did not occur in London, but in Edinburgh. Charles I was born in Scotland, but he completely lacked an operational understanding of its political and religious culture. The Scottish Kirk was fiercely Presbyterian. It possessed a highly decentralized, democratic structure governed by local elders, completely rejecting the authority of bishops. In 1637, driven by his uncompromising demand for absolute religious uniformity across his kingdoms, Charles issued a royal decree forcing a new English-style Book of Common Prayer upon the Scottish Kirk. He did this without consulting the Scottish Parliament or the General Assembly of the Kirk. The result was immediate, physical rebellion. On July 23, 1637, when the Dean of Edinburgh attempted to read the new prayer book in St. Giles Cathedral, a riot erupted. According to historical tradition, a market woman named Jenny Geddes hurled her heavy wooden stool directly at the minister's head. The riot rapidly escalated into an organized national revolution. The Scottish nobility and clergy united, signing the National Covenant in 1638. They pledged to defend their Presbyterian religion against the king's innovations, utilizing armed force if necessary. Viewing the National Covenant as an act of high treason, Charles mobilized the English militia and marched north to crush the rebellion. This conflict became known as the Bishops' Wars. The operation immediately exposed the fatal vulnerability of governing without a parliament. Charles lacked the financial capital to field a professional army. The English troops were untrained, unpaid, lacking proper logistics, and deeply sympathetic to the Protestant Scottish cause. Confronted by a motivated, battle-hardened Scottish army commanded by veterans of the 30 Years' War, the Royalist forces collapsed. The Scottish army easily routed the English, pushed across the border, and occupied the vital northern English counties of Northumberland and Durham, including the critical coal-producing city of Newcastle. Humiliated and militarily defenseless, Charles was forced to sign the Treaty of Ripon in October 1640. The terms were catastrophic for the English crown. The king was required to pay the occupying Scottish army an indemnity of £850 a day until a final peace settlement was reached. The financial mathematics were absolute. Charles was entirely bankrupt. He could not pay the Scottish indemnity, nor could he pay his own mutinous soldiers. The 11 years' tyranny was structurally broken. Charles I was forced to issue the writs for a new parliament. In November 1640, the Long Parliament convened in Westminster. The demographic was overwhelmingly hostile. Out of 493 members of the House of Commons, approximately 350 were unified in their opposition to the king's policies. They were organized and directed by John Pym, a brilliant, calculating Puritan lawyer and parliamentary tactician. Pym recognized that attacking the king directly would trigger an immediate civil war. Instead, Parliament systematically targeted the executive pillars of the king's administration. Their primary target was Thomas Wentworth, the Earl of Strafford. Strafford had functioned as the Lord Deputy of Ireland and was the king's most capable, ruthless enforcer. Parliament viewed him as the architect of the authoritarian state. When a standard impeachment trial failed to legally prove that Strafford had committed high treason, Pym bypassed the judicial system entirely. The House of Commons passed a Bill of Attainder, a legislative act that simply declared Strafford guilty by a majority vote, requiring only the king's signature to mandate his execution. King Charles I had explicitly promised Strafford, upon his royal honor, that he would protect his life and fortune. However, Pym weaponized the London populace. Massive, heavily armed mobs surrounded the Palace of Whitehall, actively threatening to storm the royal apartments and murder the Queen. Paralyzed by fear for his family's physical safety and facing the total collapse of his government, Charles's resolve broke. On May 9, 1641, he signed the Bill of Attainder. Strafford was beheaded 3 days later. By sacrificing his most loyal and capable minister to a hostile legislature, Charles destroyed his own political credibility. He proved to the opposition that the crown could be successfully intimidated by organized violence, and he alienated the royalist faction by demonstrating that his sworn protection was worthless. With the executive branch crippled, Parliament rapidly dismantled the machinery of the absolute state. They passed the Triennial Act, legally mandating that a parliament must be summoned at least every 3 years, preventing the king from ever ruling alone again. They formally abolished the prerogative courts, including the Star Chamber, stripping the king of his ability to bypass common law. Finally, they passed legislation declaring that the current parliament could not be dissolved without its own consent. Charles, trapped by the Scottish occupation and the mob, signed every bill, effectively surrendering his core sovereign powers. The political equilibrium was shattered again in October 1641 by intelligence arriving from Ireland. The strict authoritarian system established by Strafford had collapsed upon his death. The native Irish Catholics, terrified by the aggressive Protestant rhetoric emanating from the English Parliament, launched a massive, bloody rebellion, massacring thousands of Protestant settlers in Ulster. The geopolitical reality demanded that an English army be raised immediately to crush the rebellion. However, the constitutional crisis presented a severe logistical roadblock. Traditionally, the king commanded the armed forces. Parliament, deeply paranoid, flatly refused to grant Charles control of a newly raised army, suspecting he would use the troops not to pacify Ireland, but to march on London and execute the parliamentary leadership. To justify stripping the king of his military command, John Pym and the radical faction drafted the Grand Remonstrance in November 1641. It was a devastating 204-point legislative document that catalogued every single financial, religious, and diplomatic failure of Charles's entire reign. It demanded that Parliament be granted veto power over the king's appointment of ministers and control over the military. The remonstrance was debated fiercely and passed the House of Commons by a razor-thin margin of 159 to 148. This narrow vote exposed the reality of the situation. The kingdom was no longer united against the king. A significant conservative faction within Parliament, terrified by the increasing radicalism of Pym and the threat of mob rule, began to pivot back toward the crown to maintain social order. Believing he now possessed sufficient political support to reassert his authority, and convinced that Pym and the radical leaders were actively colluding with the invading Scots to commit high treason, Charles made a disastrous, impulsive tactical maneuver. On January 4, 1642, King Charles I marched directly into the House of Commons, accompanied by 400 heavily armed soldiers. His objective was to personally arrest 5 leading members of Parliament, including John Pym and John Hampden. This action was an unprecedented violation of constitutional protocol. No English monarch had ever physically entered the Commons' chamber. The king's intelligence, however, was compromised. The plan had leaked, and the 5 targeted members had already fled the building and taken refuge in the highly fortified financial district of the City of London. Standing before the stunned, silent assembly, Charles approached the Speaker's chair and demanded that Speaker William Lenthal identify the location of the missing men. Lenthal fell to his knees and delivered a definitive statement of constitutional defiance. "May it please your Majesty, I have neither eyes to see nor tongue to speak in this place, but as the House is pleased to direct me." Looking at the empty benches, Charles muttered, "I see the birds have flown," and walked out of the chamber in absolute disgrace. The attempted arrest of the 5 members was the point of no return. It confirmed Parliament's deepest fears. The king was entirely willing to use military force to subvert the legislative process. Violent armed riots erupted across the capital. The trained bands of the London militia mobilized to defend Parliament against the king. Recognizing that he had completely lost control of his capital, and fearing for the immediate physical safety of his wife and children, Charles fled London on January 10, 1642. He relocated his court to the Loyalist strongholds in the north. For the next several months, the king and Parliament engaged in a frantic paper war, issuing conflicting ordinances and desperately attempting to secure control of the county militias and the royal arsenals. Negotiation had failed. The structural mechanisms of the state had completely fractured. On August 22, 1642, King Charles I arrived in Nottingham. In a heavy, driving rain, he officially raised the royal standard, calling his loyal subjects to arms to suppress the rebellion of his parliament. The political and legal maneuvering was over. The English Civil War had begun. The raising of the royal standard at Nottingham in August 1642 initiated a devastating military conflict that fundamentally ruptured the English state. The early years of the English Civil War devolved into a bloody, exhausting stalemate. King Charles I commanded the royalist forces, the Cavaliers, drawing heavy support from the traditional aristocracy and dominating the northern and western territories. Parliament, commanding the Roundheads, controlled the massive economic engine of London, the southeastern agricultural hubs, and crucially, the Royal Navy. Major engagements at Edge Hill and Newbury produced staggering casualties, but no decisive strategic victory for either faction. The geopolitical turning point occurred in 1645. The parliamentary leadership recognized that their traditional aristocratic generals lacked the ruthless operational discipline required to annihilate the royalist forces. To break the stalemate, Parliament passed the Self-Denying Ordinance, a radical piece of legislation that stripped all sitting political leaders of their military commands. In their place, Parliament constructed the New Model Army. This institution revolutionized English warfare. It was the nation's first professional, fully funded, and centrally supplied standing army. Crucially, the command structure was entirely divorced from noble birthright. Promotion was dictated strictly by battlefield merit and extreme Puritan zeal. The highly disciplined cavalry of this new fighting force was commanded by a rising, fiercely pragmatic political operator, Oliver Cromwell. The devastating efficiency of the New Model Army was demonstrated on June 14, 1645, at the Battle of Naseby. The parliamentary forces entirely annihilated the royalist infantry and shattered Charles's cavalry. However, the true catastrophe for the king was not the military defeat, but the subsequent intelligence breach. Following the battle, parliamentary forces captured the king's personal baggage train. Within his private cabinets, they discovered a massive cache of classified royal correspondence. These documents provided undeniable, documented proof that Charles I was actively negotiating to bring foreign Catholic armies and Irish rebel mercenaries onto English soil to slaughter the parliamentary forces. The publication of these letters completely destroyed the king's political credibility. He was no longer viewed by the moderates as a misguided sovereign. He was exposed as an active domestic enemy willing to subvert the Protestant nation to maintain his absolute authority. Militarily exhausted and out of tactical options, King Charles I surrendered in May 1646, not to the English Parliament, but to the occupying Scottish Presbyterian army, hoping to exploit the growing religious friction between the Scots and the English Puritans. The Scots eventually sold the king directly to the English Parliament for £400,000 to cover their outstanding military arrears. Even as a captive of the state, Charles remained entirely incapable of negotiating in good faith. He operated under the unyielding belief that a sovereign could not be bound by treaties signed under duress. He utilized his captivity to systematically play the Parliament, the New Model Army, and the Scottish factions against one another, stalling the peace process while attempting to engineer a military rescue. In late 1647, while confined to the Isle of Wight, Charles engaged in a fatal, duplicitous diplomatic maneuver. He signed a secret treaty known as the Engagement with a faction of the Scottish nobility. He promised to officially establish Presbyterianism across England for a trial period of 3 years in direct exchange for a massive Scottish military invasion designed to destroy the New Model Army and restore his absolute power. This secret treaty detonated the Second Civil War in 1648. Royalist uprisings erupted across England to support the invading Scottish forces. The rebellion was swift, but it was ruthlessly crushed. Oliver Cromwell marched the New Model Army north and annihilated the Scottish invaders at the Battle of Preston. The initiation of the Second Civil War fundamentally altered the psychology of the New Model Army. The military command completely lost its patience with the diplomatic process. They now viewed Charles I not as a sovereign requiring constitutional restriction, but as a man of blood, a biological tyrant who would continually plunge the nation into warfare as long as he continued to draw breath. While the moderate political factions within Parliament still desperately sought a negotiated settlement with the captive king, the military apparatus took unilateral, illegal action. On December 6, 1648, the army executed a military coup. Colonel Thomas Pride, commanding a heavily armed detachment of soldiers, barricaded the doors of the House of Commons. In an event recorded as Pride's Purge, the military systematically arrested or physically locked out over 230 moderate members of Parliament who favored negotiating with the Crown. The remaining legislative body consisted of merely 50 to 80 radical Puritan members entirely subservient to the military command. This compromised assembly became known as the Rump Parliament. Their singular, unprecedented operational objective was to formally prosecute the sovereign. Placing a reigning monarch on trial presented the Rump Parliament with a massive, seemingly insurmountable legal black hole. The English judicial system possessed no structural mechanism to try a king. Under the Treason Act of 1351, the legal definition of high treason was strictly and exclusively defined as an act of violence or subversion committed against the king. Because the king was the absolute embodiment of the state, it was legally impossible for the king to commit treason against himself. To bypass this constitutional reality, the Rump Parliament passed a revolutionary unilateral legal resolution. They declared that the supreme power of the English nation lay inherently with the people, and that the House of Commons, acting as the elected representatives of the people, possessed the absolute authority to enact laws without the consent of the House of Lords or the royal assent. Operating under this newly invented legal doctrine, the Commons established a High Court of Justice, appointing 135 commissioners to serve as judges and jury. The legal establishment of England rejected the tribunal entirely. Terrified of the geopolitical implications and the blatant illegality of the process, the nation's highest-ranking judges flatly refused to participate. The Rump Parliament was forced to appoint John Bradshaw, a relatively obscure provincial lawyer, as the president of the court, and John Cook as the Solicitor General to lead the prosecution. Ultimately, only 68 of the appointed commissioners possessed the political nerve to actually attend the proceedings. The trial commenced on January 20, 1649, inside the cavernous, heavily guarded Westminster Hall. King Charles I was brought before the tribunal. He immediately asserted his absolute defiance of the court's authority by utilizing a specific visual protocol. He flatly refused to remove his hat. In 17th century society, remaining covered in the presence of legal superiors was a profound, calculated insult, visually demonstrating that the king did not recognize the commissioners as his judges. As Solicitor General John Cook began reading the formal indictment, accusing Charles Stuart of being a tyrant, traitor, murderer, and a public and implacable enemy to the Commonwealth, the king attempted to halt the reading. Charles reached out with his silver-tipped cane and tapped Cook sharply on the shoulder. Suddenly, the heavy silver head of the king's cane snapped off and clattered onto the stone floor. A profound silence descended upon the hall. In standard royal protocol, a servant or a courtier would instantly retrieve the item. No one moved. In a symbolic, psychologically crushing moment that visually manifested the collapse of his absolute power, the monarch of England was forced to bend down and retrieve the silver head himself. Despite this humiliation, Charles executed a brilliant, legally flawless defensive strategy. He categorically refused to enter a formal plea. Charles argued that the High Court of Justice was an illegal, illegitimate entity constructed by sheer military force. He positioned himself not as a divine autocrat, but as the ultimate defender of English common law. He presented an unassailable legal argument to the gallery. If a lawful, divinely anointed king could be subjected to a trial by an arbitrary, self-appointed military tribunal, then the life, liberty, and property of every common citizen in England was completely devoid of legal protection. President Bradshaw, deeply flustered and entirely outmatched in constitutional theory, possessed no valid legal counter-argument. He could only repeat the manufactured doctrine that the court was acting in the name of the people of England. Under standard English law, refusing to enter a plea was administratively classified as an automatic admission of guilt. Because the king refused to recognize the court, the tribunal retreated to private sessions to hear testimony from 33 witnesses. The objective of the prosecution was simply to formally document the obvious, that Charles had personally commanded military forces against English citizens at the battles of Edgehill and Naseby, thereby shedding the blood of his own people. On January 27, Charles was returned to Westminster Hall to hear the verdict. Recognizing that his execution was imminent, the king's stoicism finally fractured. He desperately requested permission to address a joint session of Parliament, heavily implying he was prepared to formally abdicate the throne in favor of his eldest son to save his own life. Bradshaw coldly denied the request, shutting down the king's final political maneuver. The sentence was formally read into the record. Charles Stuart was found guilty of high treason and condemned to be put to death by the severing of his head from his body. As the military guard forcibly dragged the king from the hall, Charles shouted, "I am not suffered for to speak. Expect what justice other people will have." The death warrant was drafted. It required the signatures of the commissioners to authorize the execution. Securing these signatures proved difficult, as many commissioners hesitated, terrified of the impending regicide. 59 men eventually signed the document, many acting under extreme psychological intimidation and physical pressure applied directly by Oliver Cromwell, whose own signature was the third name on the warrant. The night before his execution, Charles was permitted a final restricted meeting with his two youngest available children, 13-year-old Princess Elizabeth and 8-year-old Prince Henry. The king wept openly. He issued a strict, direct political command to young Henry, ordering the boy never to allow the army to install him as a puppet king, while his older brothers Charles and James remained alive in exile. The morning of January 30, 1649, was bitterly cold, with the River Thames frozen solid. Charles awoke at 5 a.m. and made a calculated, pragmatic request to his attendants. He asked for an extra linen shirt. The king understood that the freezing wind would naturally cause his body to shiver. He was absolutely terrified that the hostile crowd and the historical record would misinterpret a biological reaction to the cold as a display of physical cowardice. At 10 a.m., surrounded by heavily armed military regiments, Charles began the march across St. James's Park toward the Palace of Whitehall. He was held in a secure room for several hours because the Rump Parliament was frantically passing emergency, retroactive legislation to make it legally impossible for anyone to automatically proclaim Charles's son as the new sovereign upon the king's death. Just before 2 p.m., the king was led through the banqueting house at Whitehall. To access the black-draped wooden scaffold erected outside the exterior windows, Charles had to walk directly beneath the magnificent ceiling painted by Peter Paul Rubens. This ceiling was the very artwork Charles had personally commissioned years earlier, designed explicitly to celebrate the divine, untouchable glory of absolute monarchy. The architectural irony of his final steps was absolute. The military heavily cordoned off the scaffold, keeping the massive crowd of Londoners at a significant distance to prevent a rescue attempt. Consequently, Charles delivered his final speech only to the executioners and officials on the platform. Reading from a prepared document, he declared himself a martyr of the people. He stated that he forgave his executioners, but he refused to yield his core political philosophy. He declared, "A subject and a sovereign are clean different things," maintaining to his final breath that the populace possessed no inherent right to participate in the governance of the state. The state inflicted one final, calculated indignity upon the sovereign. The execution block provided was not the standard high block, where a condemned nobleman could kneel with dignity. It was a specialized, incredibly low piece of wood, barely 15 inches high, designed specifically so the king could not resist or thrash about. Charles handed his cloak and his George medallion to Bishop Juxon, issuing a single cryptic command, "Remember." This was an instruction intended for his son, demanding that he eventually forgive his enemies and not plunge the nation into an endless cycle of bloody retribution. He then tucked his long hair into a silk nightcap to provide the axe a clean strike. The executioners wore opaque masks and sailors' clothing to hide their identities. Forced to lie completely flat on his stomach, physically prostrating himself in the dirt, Charles positioned his neck over the block. He whispered a brief prayer, finally signaling his readiness by extending his hands out in front of him. A single heavy blow of the axe severed his life. The executioner lifted the severed head by the hair and displayed it to the massive crowd, but remained completely silent so his voice could not be identified. Below the scaffold, the tens of thousands of gathered citizens did not cheer the death of the tyrant. Instead, contemporary eyewitnesses universally recorded a massive haunting sound rising from the masses, such a groan as I never heard before and desire I may never hear again. In the immediate aftermath, military discipline fractured as citizens rushed the barricades, desperate to dip their handkerchiefs in the king's pooling blood, instantly transmuting the executed traitor into a holy relic. Within days of his execution, the monarchy was abolished, and England plunged into a decade of militarized rule. Yet Charles achieved a victory in death that eluded him in life. The underground publication of his spiritual memoir, Icon Basilicae, transformed the executed king into a pious martyr. When the monarchy was restored in 1660, he was canonized. King Charles I was a man of intense contradictions. He was a refined intellectual and a devoted husband, yet a rigid ruler completely incapable of compromise. His spectacular downfall left a permanent precedent written in sovereign blood. No individual is above the law. His trial proved that a king could be judged by the very people he was meant to govern, fundamentally reshaping the political landscape of Europe.